April 1945. A young Japanese nurse stands before American soldiers, trembling, expecting execution. Instead, she receives medical supplies. 1 year later, when those same soldiers tell her she's free to leave their prisoner camp, she breaks down crying and begs them, "I don't want to leave." This is the story of thousands of Japanese women who found themselves choosing between a devastated homeland and an uncertain future with their former enemies. Okinawa, April 1945. The battle had turned the island into a nightmare landscape of mud, blood, and shattered bodies. Tomiko Nakamura crouched in what remained of a field hospital, barely more than a cave with stolen medical supplies. At 24 years old, she had volunteered as a civilian nurse, believing the propaganda that serving the emperor was the highest honor a Japanese woman could achieve. Now, as American artillery thundered closer, she wrapped bandages around soldiers who would likely die within hours. The propaganda hadn't prepared her for this reality. When the American soldiers burst through the entrance, rifles raised, Tomiko closed her eyes and waited for death. She had been told repeatedly what the American devils would do to captured Japanese women. The stories were specific, graphic, designed to ensure Japanese civilians would choose suicide over surrender. But the bullet never came. Instead, a young American soldier lowered his rifle and called for a medic. Within minutes, a sergeant appeared, surveying the wounded Japanese soldiers with professional detachment rather than hatred. That sergeant was William Carter, a 28-year-old combat medic from Ohio, who had seen too much death on both sides to take pleasure in more of it. He had landed on Omaha Beach, fought through France, then volunteered for Pacific duty after his younger brother was killed at Guadalcanal. The anger that initially fueled him had long since burned out, replaced by a grim determination to save whatever lives he could, regardless of the uniform they wore. When he saw Tomiko, exhausted and terrified, still trying to treat her patients even as American soldiers surrounded her, something in her dedication struck him as profoundly familiar. Through an interpreter, Carter explained that she was being detained as a prisoner of war. The Geneva Conventions required her humane treatment. She would receive food, shelter, and medical care. Tomiko understood perhaps one word in 5, but she understood the tone. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was almost gentle. This cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality would define everything that followed. The temporary POW camp established near the Okinawa coastline held several dozen Japanese prisoners, mostly wounded soldiers, but also a handful of civilian nurses like Tomiko, who had been caught in combat zones. Female Japanese POWs were extraordinarily rare. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese military culture emphasized death over surrender so completely that fewer than 1 in 100 Japanese soldiers allowed themselves to be captured. For women, the stigma was even more severe. Tomiko's mere survival marked her as someone who had violated fundamental social codes. The camp itself defied everything she had been conditioned to expect. Prisoners received adequate rations, sometimes better food than they had eaten in months. Medical care was provided without discrimination between American wounded and Japanese POWs. The guards maintained discipline, but without the casual brutality that characterized Japanese military culture. For Tomiko, who had grown up in a society where hierarchy was enforced through ritual humiliation and violence, this American approach to prisoners was genuinely incomprehensible. Carter supervised the medical operations within the POW section. He quickly recognized that Tomiko had real nursing training, not just the basic first aid taught to civilian volunteers. She knew anatomy, understood infection protocols, could set broken bones properly. He began assigning her tasks within the camp hospital, initially under close supervision, then with increasing autonomy as he realized her competence matched or exceeded many of his own enlisted medics. They communicated through gestures, through medical terminology that crossed language barriers, through the universal language of caregiving. Carter would point to supplies and speak their English names slowly. Tomiko would repeat them, her pronunciation awkward, but her memory sharp. He learned a few Japanese medical terms in return. Within weeks, they had developed a functional working vocabulary. Within months, Tomiko could understand basic English commands and respond appropriately. The work created a strange intimacy. They stood shoulder to shoulder over operating tables, passing instruments, anticipating each other's needs. Carter learned that Tomiko had studied nursing in Tokyo before the war. that her family ran a small pharmacy, that she had 3 younger siblings. He shared that he had wanted to become a doctor before the war interrupted his education, that his family owned a hardware store in a small Ohio town, that his brother's death had nearly destroyed his mother. These conversations happened in fragments, broken English mixed with gestures and drawings, but they revealed something crucial to both of them. The enemy had a face, a family, a story. The propaganda that sustained war depended on dehumanization. Close proximity and shared purpose made dehumanization impossible. Then came August 15, 1945. The Emperor's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender reached even the POW camp. For many Japanese prisoners, this moment shattered their entire worldview more completely than any military defeat. The Emperor, considered divine, had spoken directly to his people for the first time in recorded history, and he had acknowledged defeat. Some prisoners wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few attempted suicide, prevented by guards who had been warned to expect exactly this reaction. Tomiko felt something different. A hollow, aching relief. The war was over. She had survived. But as that initial relief faded, a more terrible realization took its place. What exactly had she survived for? The war had consumed 4 years of her life. What remained of the world she had known? The answer came through Red Cross channels over the following weeks. Tokyo had been devastated by firebombing campaigns that turned 66 Japanese cities into ash. The raid on March 10, 1945, alone had killed more than 100,000 people in a single night, more than died immediately at Hiroshima. Tomiko's family had lived in the Asakusa district, directly in the path of the firestorm. The Red Cross could confirm no survivors at her family's address. Her parents, her 3 siblings, her grandparents who lived with them, all gone. The pharmacy where she had helped her father prepare medicines destroyed. The nursing school where she had studied rubble. The neighbors she had known since childhood dead or scattered. Her entire life before the war had been erased as completely as if it had never existed. She was 24 years old and she had nothing and no one to return to. Carter found her crying in the hospital supply room 3 days after she received the news. He didn't need translation to understand grief. He sat beside her in silence for a long time before speaking about his brother's death, about watching his mother collapse at the telegram, about the way loss creates a permanent empty space that never quite fills. He told her he was sorry. The war had taken too much from too many people. It needed to end. Now it had, but the ending brought no victory, just a landscape of ruins, and counting the missing. The American occupation of Japan began in September 1945 under General Douglas MacArthur. The stated goals were demilitarization, democratization, and reconstruction. The practical reality was managing a devastated nation of 70 million people, many on the edge of starvation, all struggling with the psychological shock of absolute defeat. The POW camp where Tomiko was held transitioned into a more permanent facility on the Japanese mainland, part of the larger occupation infrastructure. The Japan that Tomiko would be released into bore little resemblance to the country she remembered. Food rations dropped to 1,050 calories per day, well below subsistence level. Tuberculosis, typhoid, and other diseases spread rapidly through malnourished populations. The black market became the only reliable source of goods, with prices inflating to absurd levels. A single egg might cost more than a day's wages. Women turned to prostitution in staggering numbers, not from moral failure but from mathematical necessity. The Japanese called them pan-pan girls, women who exchanged sex with American servicemen for food, chocolate, cigarettes, anything that could be traded for survival. The social fabric had torn completely. 3 million Japanese were homeless. The traditional family structure that had defined Japanese society for centuries collapsed under economic pressure. Orphans roamed cities in desperate gangs. Widows with no male relatives to support them faced destitution. The shame culture that had sustained Japanese identity now turned inward, creating a pervasive sense of national humiliation. For someone in Tomiko's position, the outlook was particularly grim. Former POWs faced intense social stigma. They had surrendered rather than dying honorably. They had collaborated with the enemy. They were tainted, untrustworthy, shameful. No respectable family would consider marriage with a former POW. No legitimate employer would hire one. The few options available involved backbreaking labor for near-starvation wages or the sex trade. Inside the POW camp during this period, Tomiko's daily life continued with strange normalcy. She worked in the hospital alongside American medical personnel. She ate regular meals. She slept in a barracks with heat during winter. She learned English with increasing fluency. The camp existed as a bubble of order and predictability, while chaos consumed the world outside its fences. Carter remained stationed at the facility through late 1945 and into 1946. His relationship with Tomiko had evolved from professional colleagues to something neither of them quite knew how to define. They were not exactly friends. The power imbalance of prisoner and guard made genuine friendship impossible, but they were not quite strangers either. They had shared too much, seen each other at too many vulnerable moments. He had watched her receive the news about her family. She had assisted him through a crisis when a patient died from complications neither of them could prevent, and he had broken down afterward from accumulated exhaustion and trauma. They had celebrated small victories together when difficult cases survived. They had developed private jokes that needed no translation. The boundaries between them were blurring in ways that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. In January 1946, Carter's unit received notice that demobilization would begin within months. Like millions of American servicemen, he would soon return home to resume a civilian life interrupted by war. The prospect filled him with conflicting emotions. He wanted desperately to leave Japan, to escape the memories, to sleep without nightmares. But leaving meant abandoning Tomiko to a future that looked increasingly hopeless. He tried to discuss options with her. Perhaps he could help her find employment with the occupation authorities. Perhaps there were aid organizations that could assist former POWs with reintegration. Perhaps her nursing skills would open doors despite the social stigma. But every option they explored led to dead ends. The occupation needed translators and administrators, not nurses. Aid organizations were overwhelmed with millions of displaced persons and lacked resources for individual cases. Her nursing skills meant nothing in an economy where hospitals operated without basic supplies. The conversation they had avoided finally happened one evening in late February. Carter asked if she had anywhere to go when the camp finally processed her for release. She admitted she had nothing. No family, no home, no prospects, no plan beyond vague hopes that something might work out. He asked what she wanted. She said she wanted not to starve, not to sell herself, not to die forgotten in a gutter. The honesty of her desperation stripped away any pretense. He proposed marriage. The suggestion was so absurd that Tomiko initially thought she had misunderstood his English. Marriage between Japanese women and American servicemen was technically possible, but highly discouraged by military regulations. The 1924 Immigration Act had banned Japanese immigration to the United States entirely, making it nearly impossible for Japanese wives to accompany American husbands home. The social stigma in both countries was enormous. In Japan, she would be called a traitor, a collaborator, a prostitute who sold herself to the enemy. In America, he would be called a race traitor, a fool, a man who brought home a war trophy. But Carter had thought through the practical realities. New legislation was working through Congress to address the war bride situation. Thousands of American servicemen had formed relationships with women in occupied countries. The military and government were slowly accepting that preventing these marriages was impossible and cruel. The Soldier Brides Act would likely pass within a year, creating a legal pathway for foreign wives to immigrate. More importantly, he loved her. He had tried to convince himself otherwise for months. She was his prisoner. The power dynamics were wrong. The timing was impossible. The cultural differences were insurmountable. But none of those rational objections changed the fundamental truth. He loved her competence, her dedication, her dry humor that emerged once she felt safe, her resilience in the face of devastating loss. He loved the way she approached medical problems with meticulous care. He loved her terrible English pronunciation that improved daily through sheer determination. He had no illusions about easy happiness. Marriage to him would make her life harder in many ways. She would face discrimination in America that might equal or exceed what she would face in Japan. His family might reject her. His hometown might shun them both. But marriage offered something Japan could not: a future with possibilities beyond mere survival. Tomiko took 3 days to answer. She wrestled with questions that had no clean solutions. Did she love him, or did she love the safety he represented? Could she abandon her Japanese identity entirely? What would her parents think if they could somehow know? Was choosing survival over loyalty to her destroyed country an act of courage or of cowardice? The questions were impossible to answer cleanly. She did love him, though that love was entangled with gratitude, dependency, and strategic calculation. She would have to abandon much of her Japanese identity, though that identity was already irrevocably damaged by her status as a former POW. Her parents were dead and beyond judgment, and the distinction between courage and cowardice collapsed when the choice was between dying with honor and living with shame. She said yes. They married in March 1946 at a military chapel on the base, with two of Carter's medic colleagues as witnesses. No family attended from either side. The ceremony took 15 minutes. The chaplain clearly disapproved but performed his duty professionally. Tomiko wore a borrowed dress that didn't quite fit. Carter wore his service uniform. They exchanged simple gold bands purchased from the post exchange. The legal paperwork took longer than the ceremony itself. Marriage immediately complicated Tomiko's status. She was no longer exactly a POW, but she was not exactly free either. She could not leave the facility without Carter, could not work outside the camp, could not access most occupation services. She existed in a legal gray area, technically a military dependent, but without the documentation to prove it. Carter's commanding officer made clear that the military would provide no special assistance. If Carter wanted to marry an enemy national, that was his prerogative, but he would navigate the bureaucratic nightmare alone. That bureaucratic nightmare proved extensive. Tomiko needed a passport, but Japan's government infrastructure had collapsed. She needed immigration approval, but the 1924 Immigration Act remained in effect. She needed medical clearances, background investigations, proof of marriage recognized by both Japanese and American authorities. Each document required other documents, which required other approvals, which required waiting for offices to process requests at their leisure. Meanwhile, the POW facility was winding down operations. By spring 1946, most Japanese prisoners had been processed for release and repatriated to civilian life. The American military was consolidating operations, reducing staff, preparing to transition camps into other uses. Carter received his demobilization orders for June. Tomiko's paperwork remained unfinished. The timeline was becoming impossible. April 1946. An American administrative officer arrived to process the final POWs for release, including Tomiko. He was young, probably 22, clearly new to occupation duty. He had a clipboard with names and a routine he had performed dozens of times. He called Tomiko to the processing desk, checked her name against his list, and told her in simple English that she was free. Her prisoner status was terminated. She could leave the facility and return to civilian life in Japan. He seemed pleased to deliver good news. Tomiko's reaction confused him completely. She began crying, not tears of relief, but of anguish. She asked where her husband was. The officer checked his paperwork, confused, finding the notation about her marriage to Carter. He explained that Carter was currently on duty at another facility, but would return that evening. She could wait for him outside, in town. She was free now. She didn't need to stay in the camp. Her breakdown escalated. In broken English mixed with Japanese, she tried to explain that she didn't want to leave, not without Carter, not to go outside where she had nothing and no one. The camp was safe. Outside was chaos. The officer, utterly confused, tried to calm her by repeating that she was free, as if freedom were self-evidently good. But Tomiko kept saying no. She didn't want to leave. Please, don't make her leave. Carter arrived 20 minutes later, called urgently by confused guards. He found Tomiko sitting on the ground outside the administrative building, crying, refusing to move. The young officer explained the situation with bewilderment. He had told her she was free, and she had started crying and saying she didn't want to leave. Carter knelt beside his wife and held her while she sobbed into his shoulder. Later, when she could speak calmly, Tomiko tried to explain the impossible position she was in. Inside the camp she had structure, safety, purpose, and Carter's presence. Outside the camp she had only uncertainty, potential starvation, social stigma, and separation from the one person who represented stability. The camp had been her prison, but it had also become her refuge. Being told she was free to leave felt like being told she was being abandoned. This paradox was not unique to Tomiko. Throughout 1946 and 1947, American occupation authorities documented similar responses from various displaced persons. Many Japanese prisoners delayed their repatriation as long as possible. Some requested to remain in American custody, finding camp conditions superior to civilian Japan. The occupation had created a strange inversion, where imprisonment sometimes offered better prospects than freedom. For Tomiko specifically, there was an additional layer. Leaving the camp meant entering a legal limbo where she was neither prisoner nor recognized dependent. She would need to find somewhere to live, some way to support herself, while waiting for paperwork that might never be approved. And she would be separated from Carter, who remained on base unable to provide the protection his marriage theoretically granted her. The administrative officers eventually worked out a compromise. Tomiko would be officially released from POW status, but would be allowed to remain on base as a civilian employee working in the hospital. This temporary solution kept her in the camp while her immigration paperwork processed. It was irregular and required special approval, but the officers handling her case recognized the genuine humanitarian problem. Sending her into destitution while her husband was stationed right there seemed needlessly cruel. The compromise lasted 3 months. In that time, Carter worked every contact he could find to accelerate Tomiko's paperwork. He wrote to his congressional representative. He enlisted the help of the Red Cross and military chaplains. He paid fees, obtained documents, navigated bureaucratic mazes that seemed deliberately designed to be impossible. And slowly, incrementally, the necessary approvals accumulated. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In July 1946, Congress passed preliminary legislation that would eventually become the Soldier Brides Act of 1947. The new law acknowledged that American servicemen had married foreign women in significant numbers and created legal pathways for these wives to immigrate despite previous restrictions. The law specifically mentioned Japanese, German, and Italian nationals as eligible, reversing decades of race-based immigration bans. The actual implementation took months more. The law passed in July but didn't take full effect until early 1947. Applications needed to be filed, processed, investigated. Tomiko underwent medical examinations testing for tuberculosis, venereal diseases, and pregnancy. She submitted to background investigations exploring any possible connections to enemy espionage or subversive organizations. The American government wanted assurance that war brides were not security risks. By December 1946, Tomiko's application was approved in principle, pending final medical clearances. Carter had already been demobilized but remained in Japan on temporary civilian contract, unwilling to return home without her. They waited through a cold winter in temporary quarters near Tokyo, both working in occupation medical facilities, both in the strange limbo of nearly but not quite leaving. The final approval came in February 1947, nearly a year after their marriage. Tomiko would be allowed to travel to the United States as Carter's legal dependent under the new war brides provisions. She would initially enter on a temporary visa but could apply for permanent residency once in America. It was not quite citizenship, not quite equality, but it was a pathway forward. The transport ship carrying war brides and their American husbands departed from Yokohama in March 1947. Hundreds of Japanese women crowded the decks, many younger than Tomiko, some with babies from hasty marriages. The Japanese press covered the departures with a mixture of scandal and fascination. These women were called traitors by some, survivors by others, pragmatists by still others. Most simply called them desperate. Standing on the deck as Japan's coastline receded, Tomiko felt a complex cascade of emotions. Relief at leaving behind a country that held only grief and rejection. Guilt at abandoning the land where her ancestors were buried. Terror at sailing toward an unknown country that might hate her. Hope that Carter's promise of a better future might prove true. She had burned all bridges behind her. There would be no returning. She had made her choice. The journey across the Pacific took 2 weeks. The war brides formed a temporary community, sharing fears and strategies in Japanese, while their American husbands gathered separately. The women came from varied backgrounds, former geishas, shopgirls, nurses, students, farmers' daughters, but shared the common experience of choosing survival and uncertain love over remaining in a devastated homeland. They traded English phrases and advice about American customs. They warned each other about the racism they would likely face. They promised to write letters, though most never would. San Francisco Harbor appeared through morning fog, and Tomiko saw America for the first time. The city looked enormous, prosperous, untouched by the war that had devastated Japan. Buildings stood intact. Cars moved through streets. People walked with the casual confidence of those who had not starved recently. The contrast between this obvious wealth and Japan's ruin was almost painful. Immigration processing at the San Francisco port took hours. Officials examined documents, checked medical records, confirmed identities. The process was impersonal, but not cruel. Tomiko presented her papers and answered questions through an interpreter when her English failed. By late afternoon, she was cleared for entry. She was in America. Carter had arranged to take her to his family home in Ohio, a small town outside Cleveland where his parents still ran their hardware store. The train journey across the American continent astonished Tomiko. The sheer size of the country, the endless farmland, the cities that appeared and disappeared. Japan could fit into this landscape multiple times. Americans had no concept of scarcity the way Japanese did. The abundance was almost obscene. His family's reception was cooler than Tomiko had hoped, but warmer than she had feared. Carter's parents were polite, formal, clearly uncomfortable. His mother set an extra place at dinner without comment. His father asked about the weather in Japan. No one mentioned the war directly, though it hung over every interaction. Tomiko was sleeping in the house of people whose younger son had died fighting against her country. The awkwardness was inevitable. The small Ohio town where they settled had never seen a Japanese person before. Tomiko became an object of curiosity and suspicion. Children stared openly. Some adults crossed the street to avoid passing too close. The local grocery store served her, but with obvious reluctance. Someone painted Jap on their mailbox one night. Carter painted over it the next morning. The racism was different from what Tomiko had experienced in Japan. It was less overt, more insidious. People didn't scream insults directly. They just excluded her from social functions, declined to make eye contact, gossiped behind half-closed doors. She was not welcome in the local women's groups. No neighbors invited her for coffee. The Methodist church that Carter's family attended greeted her with thin-lipped politeness that never warmed into actual friendliness. But there was also food. Regular, abundant food. Electricity that worked consistently. Hot water from taps. Stores full of goods. Jobs available for those willing to work. Carter found employment at a local clinic using his medical training. Tomiko could not immediately get nursing work. Her Japanese credentials were not recognized. But she found employment at a textile factory, simple work that required no language skills. The economic security allowed gradual adaptation. Tomiko's English improved steadily. She learned to cook American food, though she quietly missed rice and fish. She adopted American clothes, though the fabrics felt wrong against her skin. She tried to walk and talk and behave like the American women she observed, though the performance exhausted her. Letters from Japan arrived sporadically through 1947 and 1948. Former camp acquaintances wrote about continued hardship. Food remained scarce. The economy remained unstable. Employment remained nearly impossible for former POWs. Several mentioned they wished they had found an American to marry too. The letters confirmed what Tomiko already knew. Had she stayed in Japan, she would likely be dead or destitute. This knowledge provided cold comfort. Yes, she had made the correct strategic decision. Yes, she was materially better off in America than she would have been in Japan. But material comfort did not resolve the deeper alienation. She was permanently displaced. No longer truly Japanese, but never quite American. She existed between identities, fully claiming neither. Carter understood this displacement better than most because he experienced his own version of it. The war had changed him in ways his family and old friends could not comprehend. He had nightmares that woke him gasping. Loud noises made him flinch. He could not stomach casual conversations about baseball and weather when his mind still held images of men dying in mud. He and Tomiko shared the bond of people who had seen the machinery of war up close and could never quite forget it. Their marriage survived the difficult early years because they built it on pragmatism rather than romantic illusion. They both knew it had started as strategic calculation mixed with genuine affection. They both knew it would be hard. They both accepted that happiness would come in small increments rather than sweeping joy. They worked together like they had in the camp hospital, practical, complementary, focused on shared goals. The broader story of Japanese war brides unfolded across thousands of similar experiences. Between 1947 and 1952, approximately 50,000 Japanese women immigrated to the United States as military brides. Some marriages thrived. Others collapsed under the pressure of culture clash and racism. The women formed informal networks, finding each other in American cities and towns, creating small communities of shared experience. In Japan, war brides were essentially written out of national memory. They were shameful reminders of defeat and collaboration. Families who lost daughters to American marriages often behaved as if those daughters had died. The Japanese government kept no official records of their departures. Histories of the occupation period mentioned them briefly, or not at all. They became invisible, un-Japanese, erased. In America, they were equally forgotten. The dominant narrative of World War II focused on American heroism, military victory, and triumphant homecoming. War brides complicated that narrative by humanizing the enemy and revealing the messy, intimate consequences of occupation. Popular culture occasionally depicted them as exotic curiosities, but serious historical attention came only decades later. Tomiko's later life followed a pattern common among war brides. She and Carter had 3 children born in the 1950s. She never returned to Japan, though she maintained correspondence with distant relatives who cautiously re-established contact in the 1960s. She never fully lost her Japanese accent. She never fully adapted to American culture, but she raised her children as Americans, speaking to them in English, teaching them American customs, wanting them to avoid the displacement she felt. The children grew up mixed race in an era when that was deeply complicated. They faced questions about their Japanese mother and their American father. They felt pressure to prove their American loyalty in ways white children never did. Some embraced their Japanese heritage. Others rejected it entirely. All carried the weight of their mother's history, whether they acknowledged it or not. Carter remained married to Tomiko until his death in 1982. By all accounts, theirs was not a passionate romance, but a functional partnership built on mutual respect and shared trauma. He defended her against racist neighbors. She supported him through health crises and career difficulties. They built a quiet life far from the dramatic circumstances of their meeting. Some might call that love. Others might call it survival. Perhaps it was both. Looking back across decades, Tomiko's breakdown at the POW camp in 1946 encapsulates something essential about war's human consequences. The moment when she cried, "I don't want to leave," revealed the impossible bind created by total war. The camp represented imprisonment, yes, but also safety, structure, and connection to the one person who made sense in a senseless world. Leaving meant freedom, but also meant stepping into chaos with no guarantee of survival. Her choice to marry Carter and immigrate to America was not simply about love, though love was part of it. It was about recognizing that her old life was utterly destroyed and would never be rebuilt. It was about choosing survival over tradition, pragmatism over honor, uncertain future over certain death. It was about accepting permanent displacement as the price of continued existence. Thousands of Japanese war brides made similar calculations. They were not traitors or victims or opportunists, though they were called all these things. They were people facing impossible choices in the aftermath of a war that had destroyed normal life. They chose as best they could with the information and options available to them. The paradox of begging not to be released from a prison camp makes sense only when you understand the context. When freedom means returning to a destroyed country with no family, no resources, and no prospects, while imprisonment means continued access to food, shelter, and the one relationship offering hope, the choice becomes obvious. Tomiko was not choosing imprisonment over freedom. She was choosing survival over abstract principle. This truth extends beyond Tomiko's individual story. The aftermath of World War II created millions of displaced persons facing similar calculations. European refugees in camps who delayed repatriation, German prisoners of war who requested to remain in American or British custody, civilians who collaborated with occupying forces in exchange for protection and food. The moral clarity of wartime. Our side versus their side, good versus evil, dissolved in peace, revealing only complex human beings trying to survive impossible circumstances. Japanese war brides represented one small thread in this larger tapestry of displacement. They numbered in the tens of thousands against tens of millions of displaced persons worldwide, but their specific story illuminates universal truths about war, survival, identity, and the choices people make when all options are terrible. The legacy of war brides continues through their children and grandchildren. Those mixed-race children of the 1950s are grandparents now themselves. They carry forward complicated family histories of enmity transformed into intimacy, of cultures crashing together in individual marriages, of parents who made choices their children would never have to make. Some grandchildren have traveled to Japan, seeking connection with heritage their grandmothers left behind. Others have never been, viewing Japan as a foreign country despite their genetic connection. The story of I Don't Want to Leave ultimately is not about a single woman in a single moment. It is about the millions of moments when people faced with catastrophic circumstances made the calculations necessary for survival. It is about the human capacity to adapt, to form connections across supposed enemy lines, to choose life even when that choice means abandoning everything familiar. It is about the price of survival and whether that price was worth paying. Tomiko would have said yes, the price was worth it. She lived 40 more years, raised children, built a life, experienced joys and sorrows far from battlefields. She never forgot Japan, never stopped feeling displaced, never fully belonged in America, but she survived. In the aftermath of total war, survival itself was victory enough. If Tomiko's story moved you, help us preserve these forgotten histories by subscribing to our channel. Your subscription ensures more untold stories from history reach audiences who need to hear them. Hit the like button if you believe these war brides' experiences deserve to be remembered, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Did your family have similar experiences during or after World War II? Do you have questions about this period of history? Your engagement helps YouTube share these important stories with more people. Subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering the human stories behind historical events that shaped our world.